Here we are today in eastern Kittitas County, Washington, just along the western shore of the Columbia River. And it has been a very warm day, but we have discovered amazing things out here. This desert is alive. We have seen all kinds of birds. We've had an amazing experience with honeybees in a lava tube full of honeycomb. Incredible. We've seen loads of blooming plants in the driest, most inhospitable territory you can imagine. And these gorgeous flowers are blooming, native flowers. Seen all kinds of early blooming flowers that normally don't bloom till the middle to the end of August, but they're already out blooming. So we will talk about all these. This desert is unique in Washington State because it is in the rain shadow of the Cascade Mountains. And I want to visit with you about rain shadows briefly here. A rain shadow is an area that does not receive much moisture. This area receives between 6 and 8 inches of annual precipitation. And the reason is because the Cascade Mountains to the west of us catch most of the precip in the form of snow or rain. And so by the time the clouds get over the Cascade Mountains to this area, they've been pretty much wrung out and there's just not much precip left. However, this last winter, there was over 1.5 feet, 2 feet of snow in this area, but evidence of that snow is gone. And it is hot, very, very dry, and the plants are very, very dry. But the interesting thing is they are blooming. So there was ample precipitation this last winter, and by them blooming, they have attracted dozens and dozens of pollinators. And pollinators, as we all know, are extremely important to the ecosystem of this area and all up and down the eastern slope of the Cascade Mountains. So here in Kittitas County, we have had the opportunity to go to all kinds of areas that are bone dry. Amazingly interesting areas because of the geology, because of the plant communities that are present, because of the insects that are present. And the evidence I see on the ground all over here is of large populations of wildlife in the form of mammals. I have seen areas here that are loaded with coyote scat, both adult and pups. I've seen loads of mountain sheep droppings. I've seen lots of turkey droppings and lots of tracks. So this area has abundant wildlife. And the reason is because of this large riparian area directly behind me. And this is here because of the stream that's coming out of the east slope of the Cascades and flows into the Columbia River. And that stream brings water to this area and allows these huge trees and a vast diversity of plants to live in this riparian zone. And it's known as a buffer zone, a buffer between the desert and the water. And it is the riparian areas that are incredibly important in this area, in the region of eastern Washington, because riparian areas foster and host 82% of all the wildlife in Washington State has some section or some portion of the cycle of their life in a riparian zone. So that's a lot of animals that depend on riparian areas. So the desert is utilized, but those riparian areas are really utilized. And because this particular riparian area is along a desert stream, it is very, very important. So right now, migration is on, bird migration. And birds, especially songbirds, are starting to move south, and fall migration is an extremely long and drawn out event. And so many bird species probably bred in this area, and they're just hanging around. They're grabbing insects and they're loafing and preening and molting. They're just here enjoying the warm weather and the water and the abundant supply of insects. And as August proceeds, they will start moving south. And when these migrants start moving south, they move at night. They're nocturnal migrants. And that's super important to remember because they migrate with the stars. And that is a whole other story that we'll get into later. But right now we are sitting in what is called a vagrant trap. And these are areas where many dozens of species of neotropic migrant birds breed, or they spend the early days of fall right here. And the dog days of August are very important to them. And then they start migrating at night. And every night, the next morning after the nightfall, there'll be a whole set of different birds here. And so it's an amazing area. Another thing that's super important about this area is the plant community that's here. Right now, there are snow buckwheat and several other species of rabbit brush that are just starting to come out in bloom. And these plants bloom during the very driest, hottest, windiest portion of the summer. You have to understand that plants spend immense amounts of energy to produce leaves and blooms. And when they produce the blooms, then they produce nectar and pollen. And the insects are there after the nectar, and the pollen gets spread by insects, not intentionally, but because they're after nectar, they get it stuck in the hairs all over their body, and they go to the next flower and they pollinate it. All kinds of plants provide nectar, which is super important to insects, rodents, and birds, and they feed on that nectar. And that gives them energy to continue doing what they're doing. And it also allows them to spread pollen everywhere they go. And so that is how plants, get pollinated. One of the things to always remember is how important pollinators are in the big picture. There are portions of this earth right now that have run out of pollinators, and they actually have people with tiny little camel hair brushes pollinating fruit trees because there are no bees. So please protect our bees, protect our pollinators, and pollinators are super important because of what they do and the role they play. And I would like to just give you a list of pollinators to be very protective of. And lots of people go, oh, I hate those. It doesn't matter how you feel about them. Leave them alone and protect them. So ants, beetles, wasps, hornets, butterflies, hummingbirds, mice, all are pollinators. And so all this big array of pollinators all live right here in this desert and in this riparian area. And they are super important to the survival and function of this area. So this morning, our day started at a place called Verbena Bridge. Verbena has a great big rest stop area, and the area was absolutely loaded with common nighthawks. Common nighthawk belongs to the nightjar family, and its Latin name is Capra mugiformes. And these large insectivores feed, they're crepuscular feeders, and they fly early in the evening and late at night into the early morning. And then they come and roost lengthwise along a horizontal branch, and they will sit there all day and they go to sleep. And periodically they'll wake up and you hear and then they go back to sleep. Well, this morning, because it was very overcast at Verbena, they were flying everywhere. We'd have 10, 12 at a time in the air flying around Verbena rest stop. So this is a bird that is entirely an insectivore, and they do not winter here. Common nighthawks leave here in end of August, early September, into the middle of September, and they go all the way down into the desert southwest. And they spend the winter in Chihuahua, Mexico, as far down as central Mexico, and in the Mojave and the Chihuahuan Desert, the Sonoran Desert, and that's where they winter. And then starting by late May, middle of May. They'll be here again by the 24th or so of May. So they are an absolutely camouflaged bird, and they nest on the ground, and they build a little scrape in the soft sand near a bush, and they will lay 2 eggs. And these eggs are oval, and when they first are laid, they're pink, and as they mature, they become white. And the adult female sits on those, and she is so camouflaged that if you were to walk by her and she didn't move, you'd never see her. So I have been out working, doing all kinds of wildlife surveys, and have come across nighthawks sitting on their nest. And they are just sure they're hidden because they are so well camouflaged. And when they suddenly realize that you've seen them, they will flush, and they fly low over the ground, hit the ground, and they do a display as if they are injured. And they will lift a wing and twitch, and they're trying to get you away from the nest so you'll chase them. And if you stick in the area, then the male comes in, and he gets up, and he'll get up about 100 feet in the air, and he will come down right over your head, and you'll hear, and it's called booming, and it is to scare you out of their territory. But it's the most unexpected thing. And if you ever get to experience it, you will never forget it. So these beautiful common nighthawks are common in some areas. In other areas, their populations have declined remarkably because of the lack of insects. And the reason for that is that those are urban areas, and lots of people think every bug is a bad bug, and they use pesticides all over their lawns, and they have no idea what it is they're killing. And they're broad spectrum pesticides, and that starts to impact the birds that depend on those insects for food. And that kills moths, their caterpillars, everything. And so I would urge folks, please be very sparing on pesticides, and call up a professional who knows what they're doing. Because once you start using pesticides, you start affecting native protected birds by these poisons, and they often don't break down for a long time. So very important to know. Nighthawks also will roost in the same tree with 5 or 6 other nighthawks or more, and so that's always interesting to see. So today I was sitting there watching these 22 brown-headed cowbirds, and they were either juveniles or female. And this is a bird that is a species that is a parasite. Brown-headed cowbird females will hunt down another bird species nest, like a yellow warbler or a warbling vireo, and they will lay 1 egg in it. And that egg will hatch 2 or 3 days ahead of the host's young, and it will become the dominant bird in that nest. And as the chicks of that host species hatch out, the cowbird's chick pushes them all out of the nest and then starts to ravenously eat from that host bird, which oftentimes is 1/3 to half its size. And so those birds just feed that chick like mad. They have none of their own left. And that chick just grows and grows and grows because it's the only one left in the nest. As it gains its flight feathers, it starts to follow that host bird around, saying, feed me, constantly begging. And eventually something clicks in the mind of the host species, and it's like, hey, wait a minute, this is not my chick. I didn't lay this chick. And they abandon that baby cowbird. And they form creches or groups, and they go out and feed with each other. And so brown-headed cowbirds are a threat to many endangered species of North American birds. And in some states, they actually have programs to reduce their populations. So brown-headed cowbirds are considered a neotropic migrant and are actually on the protected species list. So the interesting thing is, in many areas, they're not greatly appreciated. by either birds, their neighbors, or humans. But they are a protected bird nonetheless. An insect we had today that we saw several of is the spiderhawk. We were able to sit and watch this black spiderhawk digging his burrow. And he just gets down and starts digging out this ground burrow. And the rate of removal of sand is mind-boggling. This little 1-inch insect can excavate a burrow within minutes. And the amount of soil he displaces and creates a burrow in is just incredible. So they build this burrow for one reason, and that is they go out after spiders. That's why they're called the spiderhawk. And they sting it, which does not kill the spider, but causes it to be stunned. And the spider is just stunned. And then some spiderhawks shear the legs off the spider. It's still very much alive, flies it back to its burrow, takes it down in the burrow, lays an egg on it, its egg, and then seals up the hole. And when it does that, that egg hatches out in sometimes 3 or 4 days, and then it will start feeding on that living body of the spider. So that is how nature determines how to control spider populations. And this time of year, there are huge numbers of orb spiders, which we also found today. And they are in just about every bush that you walk by. All the sagebrush, all the rabbit brush, all of the snow buckwheat, all have orb spiders in them. And those orb spiders have webs out everywhere, and they're hoping to catch insects before they lay their eggs. They want to feed. And so they're hoping a moth or a butterfly or a beetle or a fly gets lodged in their web. Well, unfortunately for some of them, along comes a spiderhawk and catches them. The interesting thing is, in the deserts of the Pacific Northwest, I have found spiderhawks on warm December days out looking for spiders. So the question is, where do these spiderhawks hold up during the cold part of the winter? And if there's a warm, balmy day, they appear. Well, my guess is they're down in a burrow waiting for that weather to change. And when it warms, they come up. It nectars on rabbit brush and snow buckwheat and all kinds of other native flowers. So pretty amazing animal. Another animal that we witnessed today were several species of sulfur butterflies. And sulfurs are very ground oriented, and they nectar on plants that are blooming in artificial areas like rest stops and yards and parks. And they do that because they love those little clover and they love the dandelion blooms, and that's what they feed on. So they're getting nectar. And while they're getting nectar, they're spreading dandelion or clover pollen all over their body because of all the hairs on their body. And then they go visit the next one and they're pollinating. But that's not their intent. So really an amazing process. Sulfurs in the Pacific Northwest, there are at least 5 species of sulfurs that are expected in the Northwest during the summer months. And they are absolutely beautiful. Some of them have broad black borders and then very, very yellow or orange yellow or orange red almost. And they are very fast flyers. But it takes them a while to warm up in the mornings, and that's the best time to photograph them. Another plant that we found today was willow herb. And this is a wispy, thin-stemmed, tall, lanky looking plant with beautiful, tiny, four-petaled flowers. And the flowers are a pale pink. And this plant is just gorgeous. And it's closely related to fireweed, which is a big, bulky, sturdy columnar plant that grows all over the forests of the Pacific Northwest. And it is an indicator of disturbed lands or where a fire's been. Willow herb, on the other side, is entirely an indicator of disturbed soils, like along the edges of roads or paths or pastures. And it grows very well there. But it flowers and blooms in the hottest, driest portion of the summer. So I want you to be thinking about plants that produce beautiful blooms in the very driest, hottest portion of the year. This morning we came across this beautiful sand dune, and we found another blooming native plant, and that was the green stem primrose, which is absolutely gorgeous. And it has white flowers, and some plants have very pinkish flowers. And this is a plant that blooms, again, in the very hottest, driest sand dune it can possibly find. And they grow, and some of their plants get 10, 12, 13 inches tall, and they will have dozens of blossoms on them. Absolutely gorgeous. And they are pollinated by ants, bees, and moths. And being a primrose, they bloom in the evening, and by mid-morning they're starting to close up, and those particular blooms are done. And then new blooms open up the next night. So it is a plant that if you miss the first round of blooms, you might have a second chance. They are incredibly beautiful, and it always amazes me that they are able to bloom with the guts and the gusto that they have in these incredibly dry sites. Another incredible thing we discovered today, as I mentioned earlier, is that we found a lava tube, which is a geologic formation and a rim rock face that is basically a large bubble that occurred in molten lava. And in these lava tubes, all kinds of animals live. Well, this particular lava tube had European honeybees living in it. And they had built about 15 different honeycombs from the ceiling of the lava tube, and you could see where an animal had come in and chewed the bottom of 4 or 5 of them off, and had eaten the grubs and honey and the wax of the comb. But there were all kinds of combs in there, and bees coming and going constantly. So what they had to be nectaring on and getting their pollen from and their nectar were primrose, sand verbena, rabbit brush, and snow buckwheat. And those were the plants that were just starting to bloom. So the other question is, where were they getting their water? Well, about 1.5 miles to the west was the Columbia River. So they're having to fly at least 1.5 miles west to reach water on the shoreline of the Columbia so that they could drink and keep going. There were not large numbers of bees in this colony. They were spread out, and they were coming in 5s and 6s to this comb. It was an amazing thing, as you will see, to see these combs attached to the ceiling of a basalt lava tube, and these bees bringing sustenance to their grubs in those combs. Amazing. So it's something you would never expect to see out in a desert that was at the time about 98 degrees, and